it absolutely boggles me. Like sometimes I will give talks and all over the world, and I can't tell you how often I will say, what is the best way for students to learn? Is it rereading, underlining or highlighting, retrieval practice, that is like using flashcards, or concept mapping? Concept mapping wins out like virtually all the time. And the reality is, in top-notch journals, there are hundreds of articles that show how much superior retrieval practice, simply using flashcards and so forth, is. We got onto this big constructivist kick through the 80s, 90s, and even through now. And it's supposed to be, you construct your own knowledge. And the idea of anything that smacked of memorization, which is kind of what you're doing when you're using flashcards, became a bad, sinful thing. But it's, you can't understand something if you haven't learned it, if you don't have it in your own mind, if it's not in your memory.
And you don't practice retrieving it. As test prep professionals,
this is like preaching to the choir.
On the testing effect all the time, and retrieval practice is fundamental. And we're noticing, to your point, Barb, that a lot of educators are starting to come around to the idea that some of the old concepts of memorizing your multiplication tables and learning phonics, like going back to that stuff, and maybe vocabulary, even like we're coming back around to the old
learning.
Classics.
There is a foundation of knowledge, like that kind of rote knowledge that you have to build upon. And if we say that there isn't, we don't build that sort of foundation with which to kind of create that schema that we're talking about. And actually, the study skills work that we do with students, Mike, I'm listening to this and going, this is all a part of this, because I have diagrams and things. But what I think is so powerful is the more students know about the neuroscience behind learning, they can make informed choices or better choices about how they're going to learn best, right? As opposed to thinking, if I just look at this piece of paper enough times, that means I know it, right?
Doesn't it boggle you that students can go through 12 to 16 or more years of education and never have a single course on how to learn effectively? I mean,
which is staggering, because while there is some quality research out there, there's not a ton of it. There's not so many new breakthroughs in learning technology or understanding that doesn't come back to the same about learning speed, working memory, retrieval practice, interleaving. Like there's just the same.
Well, I think the difference, Mike, is
all the time.
What I say is, right, I went to college, went to get my degree in education now, I don't know, maybe over 30 years ago. And I'm just fascinated by all of the research, all of the information really in the last few years, where I'm like, oh, I'm learning so much because I just never thought about learning this way, and how it informs the process of working with students, what I can share and tell them. Here's what works. Here's what doesn't work. It's wonderful, because in the work we do as testing, everything you're saying, Barb, about you got to know certain things to be able to apply them. You got to recognize you know them. And that's really a lot of what test prep is about. And then, of course, you combine that with having to do it quickly. And that's a whole other element, right? Is being able to think and act quickly based upon the information you know.
Well, I think the big asset that you provide for your learners is that you're like, you're exactly right, Mike. You can like spend years combing the web and find the same old stuff, most of it just a retread of what's been taught over the last 20, 30 years. But there is this great new stuff coming out. For example, why would you have to learn your multiplication tables? Well, it's because that uses a completely different system in your brain, the basal ganglia, that is the same system that allows you to learn and speak your own native language intuitively and naturally without even thinking about it.
How interesting.
Well, you get the automaticity. That's what we want. We want the automaticity with it, right?
Yeah. Right. And we've always been like, oh no, automaticity, that just means you've done rote stuff. I'm sorry, but I can speak my native language automatically, and that doesn't mean that I speak it like a robot. It's
Right.
I
As opposed to the pain of trying to conjugate a verb in a language you are not automatic with, and you just can't even progress past the simple present tense, where so obviously there is a lot to automaticity, especially because the lack of that is a barrier to learning more. You have to
and
get past that hurdle every time if you have to do it manually.
exactly, because see, these two different systems of placing links into long-term memory. If you learn something declaratively, it's flexible, you got it, and it's really slow. And it doesn't allow you to gain an intuitive sense of patterns. Now, the procedural system through the basal ganglia, that is completely different. You learn that, that's rote learning. So you learn your multiplication tables, grinding it in through rote. But if you do it intelligently, you begin to discern the relationships between those numbers. And that's exactly what that basal ganglia habitual learning system does. It's a pattern recognition system that allows you to unconsciously but intuitively begin to understand patterns. That's why you can do a Rubik's Cube with lots of practice. And you can't explain how you do it because you learned it through this basal ganglia system. Interestingly, in the 1980s, it had always been that IQ scores were rising until about the 80s. What happened in the 80s? They started to decline even within families. And my gut sense is that's when everybody said, hey, we've got these calculators. You can just start using calculators. There's no need to do rote learning with math. And learning changed or teaching changed. And that's what you're doing is I think you're bringing back some of the best of the traditional techniques, but with insight from neuroscience and from the best of all techniques so that because students just don't know how to learn effectively, and you can help with this process.